All right, let's talk about tools. Lots of you ask me if you can get started in woodworking on a tight budget. So, I went on a mission. I walked into Walmart with one goal, to buy a complete set of woodworking tools. I grabbed everything I thought I'd need for a decent project. I got a circular saw, a jigsaw, a drill, and even a small router. I found some clamps, sandpaper, drill bits, and screws. The brand on most of these was Hyper Tough. The name sounds promising, right? Let's see if they live up to it. My cart was full, and my wallet wasn't totally empty. That's a good start. Unboxing everything back in the shop was an experience. The first thing you notice is the plastic. Lots and lots of plastic. The tools feel incredibly lightweight. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? A heavy tool can feel sturdy, but a light tool is easier to handle for a long time. The drill felt okay in my hand, but the trigger felt a little mushy. The circular saw was small, which could be great for breaking down plywood. Some things were surprisingly nice. The set of drill bits came in a decent case, and the packaging was easy to open. No frustrating clamshell plastic to fight with. That's a win in my book. On the other hand, some things felt, well, cheap. The clamps were the biggest red flag for me. They were mostly plastic, and the bar felt like it could bend pretty easily. I squeezed the trigger a few times, and it just didn't feel strong. Clamping pressure is super important for good glue-ups, so I was already worried about those. The router felt more like a toy than a tool. It was tiny and had very few adjustments. I also picked up a small pack of screws. They looked okay, but you never know if the heads will strip out easily until you start driving them. It was a mixed bag, for sure. So, what's the plan? I'm not just going to make a simple box. That's too easy. I'm going to build a mid-century modern bedside table. This project needs accurate cuts, angled legs, and drawers. That means we need strong joinery like dados and rabbets. This is a real test. Can these budget-friendly tools handle something more complex? Can they cut hardwood without burning out? Will the batteries last? We're going to push these tools to their limits and see what happens. This is Walmart woodworking versus a real furniture project. Let's find out if you can build something you'd be proud of with tools from the big box store. First up was the circular saw. I needed to break down a big sheet of plywood for the main box of the bedside table. I clamped down a straight edge to guide the saw. I pulled the trigger, and the saw whirred to life. It sounded a little whiny, not like the powerful roar of my usual saw. But you know what? It made the cut. It was slower than I'm used to, and I had to be careful not to push it too hard. I could feel the motor straining a little, but it got the job done. For cutting down big sheets into smaller, manageable pieces, it worked just fine. No smoke, no scary noises, so that's a good sign. Next, I needed to cut the angled legs from a piece of solid oak. This is hardwood, a much bigger challenge than plywood. I swapped the blade on the circular saw for a new one, hoping it would help. Making these angled cuts required a lot of precision. I marked my lines very carefully. The saw struggled more with the oak. I had to go really slow to avoid burning the wood or bogging down the motor. It felt like the tool was at its absolute limit. It did make the cuts, but they weren't perfectly clean. The edges were a bit rough and needed a lot of sanding later. It survived, but just barely. Now for the drawers. I needed to cut some curves for the drawer pulls, a classic mid-century modern detail. This is a job for a jigsaw. The Hyper Tough jigsaw felt okay, but the blade that came with it was very flimsy. I put in the blade and it wobbled a little, which is not great for accuracy. I started cutting the curve, and the saw jumped around a lot. It was hard to control and follow the line precisely. The final curve was wavy and rough. It took a lot of work with a sander to smooth it out. The jigsaw works, but it's not a precision tool by any means. The biggest test was joinery. I needed to cut dados, which are grooves in the wood for the shelves and drawer slides. A router is the best tool for this. The little Walmart router was my biggest concern. I set it up with a straight bit and a guide. When I turned it on, it screamed. It was loud and vibrated a lot in my hands. I tried to cut a dado in the plywood, and it was a battle. The router wanted to jump all over the place. The cut was messy, and the depth was inconsistent. After one dado, the motor was hot. This is where a cheap tool really shows its weakness. With all the pieces cut, it was time for assembly. This meant drilling a lot of holes and driving a lot of screws. I grabbed the Hyper Tough drill. The battery was fully charged. The drill felt comfortable enough to hold. I started by drilling pilot holes for the screws. The drill bits that came in the kit were, okay, they worked fine in the plywood, but when I moved to the solid oak legs, one of the smaller bits snapped right in half. That was a bit of a letdown. I had to switch to one of my own bits to finish the job. The drill itself had enough power for the job, though. Next came the screws. I started driving the screws to attach the legs to the main cabinet. The included screws were a problem. The heads were made of soft metal. The screwdriver bit kept slipping and stripping the heads, even with pilot holes. I managed to get a few in, but then I gave up and switched to some better screws I already had. This is a common issue with cheap hardware. A bad screw can ruin your project and cause a lot of frustration. The drill, however, did a fine job of driving the better quality screws. The battery life was also decent, lasting through the whole assembly process. Sanding is never the most fun part of woodworking, but it's so important. I didn't have a power sander from Walmart, so I did it all by hand. I used the sandpaper I bought there. The paper held up reasonably well. It didn't tear apart instantly like some cheap papers do. It took a lot of elbow grease to smooth out the rough cuts from the jigsaw and circular saw. My arms were tired. This is one area where spending a little more on a random orbit sander would save you hours of work and give you a much better finish. But for a true budget build, hand sanding gets the job done eventually. Finally, the glue up. This is the moment of truth for any project, and it all depends on your clamps. I brought out the plastic Walmart clamps I was so worried about. I applied glue to the joints and started tightening the clamps to hold the cabinet together while the glue dried. Just as I feared, they were not strong enough. The bars started to bow as I applied pressure. The cabinet wasn't held perfectly square. I had to add some of my own heavy-duty clamps to get the joints tight and aligned properly. These clamps might be okay for holding something light in place, but for furniture assembly, they just can't provide the necessary force. Now for the finishing touches. I wanted a two-tone look with a painted cabinet and stained legs. I bought a can of stain and a can of paint from Walmart, along with some foam brushes and a small roller. I started with the stain on the oak legs. The foam brush worked surprisingly well for applying the stain. It didn't leave streaks and was easy to control. It soaked up a lot of stain, but it did the job smoothly. After wiping off the excess, the oak grain looked fantastic. No complaints here. For a simple staining job, a cheap foam brush is all you really need. Next, I painted the main plywood cabinet. I used the small roller for the large, flat surfaces. The roller cover shed a little bit of fuzz into the paint, which was annoying. I had to pick the little fibers out of the wet paint as I went. It gave an okay finish, but it wasn't perfectly smooth because of the texture the roller left behind. For the inside corners and edges, I used a cheap bristle brush. It left a lot of brush strokes. A higher quality brush would have definitely given a better result. The finish is acceptable from a distance, but up close, you can see the imperfections. So, here it is. The finished mid-century modern bedside table, built entirely with Walmart tools. Does it look good? From a few feet away, yes. It's a functional piece of furniture. The design is there, the drawers slide open, and it's sturdy. But if you look closely, you can see the flaws. The joints aren't as tight as they should be thanks to the weak clamps. The curved cuts on the drawers are a little imperfect. The paint finish has some texture to it. These are all the little compromises you make when using budget tools. But did I succeed? Absolutely. I built a real piece of furniture. So what's the final verdict? Can you build real furniture with Walmart tools? The answer is yes. But with some big exceptions. The drill was the surprise winner. It had enough power and the battery lasted. It's a great tool for a beginner. The circular saw is okay for breaking down plywood but struggles with hardwood. The jigsaw and router were the biggest letdowns. They were hard to control and gave messy results. I would definitely recommend upgrading those two as soon as you can. And please, please buy better clamps and screws. They are not expensive, and they will save you so much trouble and give you a much better result in the end.